This is Supple Podcast 10 with me, Rémy Miller. And today we'll be looking at the book, The Disciplined Mind, Beyond Facts and Standard Tests, the K-12 Education That Every Child Deserves by Howard Gardner. Now, Howard Gardner is a psychologist that made more of his fame before the turn of the century, before 2000, with his idea of multiple intelligences. Beforehand, in the early years of psychology, there was this idea that intelligence was one single framework, and that you could measure everything relevant to intelligence by the intelligence quotient, or the IQ test. And we've come to discover over time that the IQ test, or the WAYS as it's known more officially, its label, is really only one measure of intelligence. And this is valued in schools, and it's valued in the workplace. And there are other types of intelligence, like emotional intelligence, that most people are familiar with. And Gardner suggests that there are many more. There's physical intelligence. There is your standard mathematics and cognitive intelligence, as can be easily measured by the WAYS, the IQ test, and an incredible five more. There are seven that he proposed. And this book, The Disciplined Mind, is really, how do we take what we've learned about the fact of multiple intelligences and incorporate that into the education environment? How do we inject this into schools so that we can have the children flourish as much as possible? So that is what this book covers. And I must admit that at first I wasn't really getting into the book. I'm not exactly sure what it was. I don't know if it was just the writing style or if it was the content of the book itself, but I suppose as I familiarized myself with the book, going through the pages, I began to like it more. Kind of like an exposure therapy type of thing, I suppose. And I just mere exposured myself into liking it more. But that's not such a bad thing, because this book certainly has many, many good ideas to offer. And I would like to take a look at those. So we'll start here. This is near the beginning. So in this area of the book, he's talking about a virtue-filled education in the disciplines. That's the name of this subtopic within this chapter. And here we go. The delineation of these three virtues, and the three virtues he's talking about here are truth, beauty, and knowledge. Man, I should have definitely consulted this in better advance of starting here. I believe it is on this other page. But yes, it is. I believe it is those true. It is beauty. It is goodness, which is kind of morality, and it is truth. And they're the inverse of those that he outlines. It's falsity as the inverse of truth, as the opposite alternative. Ugliness to beauty, and evil to goodness. So those are the three. The delineation of these three virtues and the extent to which they are distinguished from one another differ significantly across cultures. Traditionally, the most important truths have been religious ones, the culture's beliefs about what human beings are, what place they occupy in the cosmos, how they relate to deities and other spiritual figures, and which divine forces determine one's fate. Even truths that may seem mundane, for example, the names and identities of particular individuals or species, are often tinged with totemic significance. Gradually, as discoveries are made, the number of truths increases. And he actually goes on here, but I want to stop there mid-sentence, because that is something very relevant to, well, as you may have guessed, our education system, which is, how do we go about educating the human beings which are unaware of these things, e.g. children, how do we go about imparting this upon them, the truths and discoveries in the world? And what does that imply for the proportion of how that's done? Because as civilization progresses, more discoveries are made. Therefore, more empirical knowledge is accrued. So in a world in which we have an increasing and likely exponentially increasing rate of empirical knowledge that is known, what do we do about that in schools? Does that mean that we have to ramp up the amount of facts and knowledge that these students have to remember because that's what's going on in the world? Or do we take an alternate approach, which is by equipping them with the tools and principles which will allow them to evaluate the world? Do we give them essentially the tools to be able to build what means beauty and what means truth and what means goodness? Or do we just give them more knowledge? Now, my initial reflex off the bat is to say what we do is we give them the tools. We give them the principles on which to base their assessments and judgments and the validity of their personal pursuits. For example, it would be in violation of all three of those to burn a library with people in it. That is not beautiful. It is destroying truth, and it is not good to kill people. So something like that would be far away from those three virtues. And do we tell them and give them examples of the bases of these virtues in order for them to make their own judgments? Because if you just give them bit of info after bit of info after bit of info, it becomes a lot harder to take all of that and assimilate that down into a principle rather than giving them a principle and extrapolating out from it. So in the face of an increasing body of knowledge generally in the world, I believe education systems should show more or less, should show less strictness on what is taught and learned, which is to say less strictness on this. You're learning about world history in grade 5, and then you're learning about World War I in grade 6, and then World War II in grade 7, and then everything else. It's the pedagogy behind that, I think, is a little misled on exactly what would bring the best benefit to students and therefore society. Back to the book here. Over time, then, educational institutions have had the primary task of conveying to a culture's young its current take on what is true and not true, what is beautiful and what lacks beauty, what is good and what is evil. More controversial nowadays is the proper compass of education. Few would deny to the school the primary role in the inculcation of knowledge and truth. However, whether schools should be the principal communicators of beauty and goodness is much less certain. So that's exactly what we're just talking about here, which is how much weight should schools have in the determination of conveying what is beautiful and what is good? Should they be able to do that to a large degree or to a small degree? Because part of what is separated, is delineated there, is possibly this idea of siloing the three. So you cover what is true in education systems in school. You cover what is good in your extracurricular moral teachings, which may be something like religion, how it's been referred to, or how it's been practiced for the longest time, or perhaps just spirituality in a secular sense. And what is beautiful, which is what you get through your personal pursuits, perhaps at home, where you play music, or you create art, or you do something else creative, and through that discover what is beautiful. should they be siloed, or should they be assimilated into one entity? And I think that they definitely deserve some combination in the school system, because understanding comes from an assimilation of everything at once. And you get that when you combine truth, beauty, and goodness. You can't just look at each one of them individually, because they're confluential, in the sense that when you make a decision in the world of what you should do, and in the language of Howard Gardner, that comes down to fulfilling the three virtues. If you are in an argument with a person and you're about to say something, is that going to reflect what you know to be true, what you know to be beautiful, and what you know to be good? Or if you're making a plan for your personal life, or a plan for a project in the workplace, what does that look like? How does that appeal to these three values? And it's a shame for this to be the case, that they have significant siloing, because students should be introduced to how the unity of all of these facets contribute to the nature of a complete human. There is not education and then goodness. It's a whole package which must be mutually and concurrently developed. You can't say that you're going to get one in school, one at church, and one at home, because then a hierarchy develops where you say that one is more important than the other. And that's not necessarily the case, but that can definitely contribute to that. You have this tertiary setup, and all three things are separate, and you value one more than the other. There's kind of a ranking to that, which can be pernicious in a lot of ways if you're not careful with it. So this is, back to the book here, this is something that I have highlights going over the span of about 1.5 pages here. And I'm not going to read all 1.5 of the pages. So I'm going to do a little bit of hopping and skipping here. So here he's talking about perennial choices. So to the book. So far, I have stressed the quartet of purposes that spans educational time and space: to transmit roles, to convey cultural values, to inculcate literacies, and to communicate certain disciplinary content and ways of thinking. I have emphasized the trio of virtues that have long animated education: a search with one's culture for what is true, what is beautiful, and what is good. It is important to recognize, however, that educational institutions have implemented these in various ways. Over time, the pendulum has oscillated between a number of polarities, between breadth and depth. In general, the push has been toward covering as much information, conveying as many truths as possible. However, the advantage of pursuing a smaller number of topics in far greater depth has also been recognized intermittently. The British-American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead maintained, quote, "Let the main ideas which are introduced into a child's education be few and important, and let them be thrown into every combination possible," unquote. So that's essentially what I was just talking about, with the amount of information versus the depth of the information and the first principles thinking at play there. Next, between accumulation and construction of knowledge. The majority of schools over time have stressed the importance of accumulating a great amount of knowledge that is prized by the society. The teacher lectures, the textbook is read, knowledge is absorbed, retained, and spat back. Indeed, medieval texts often devoted considerable attention to how to memorize the material faithfully, how best to fill the mental vessel. However, a rival constructive or transformative stance toward knowledge dates back to classical times. It is exemplified in the colloquies of Socrates. Some educators call for the tackling of enigmatic questions and place a premium on struggling with alternative responses and on students' efforts to construct a personal conclusion as a result of sober reconsiderations of the question. Between utilitarian outcomes and intellectual growth for its own sake. There have long been pressures on educators to communicate the utility of their teaching, if not for making more money or staying ahead of the Japanese, at least for smoothing one's entry to heaven. The importance of knowledge on its own right. That's a key element here. But an alternative tradition associated particularly with English educators like John Cardinal Newman and anciently with Cicero and Confucius argues for the importance of knowledge on its own right. In this view, exploration of the world and development of the spirit are important virtues, whether or not they lead to greater material goods. Next, between uniform and individualized education. Most schools have been uniform in the sense that they've taught and assessed all individuals in essentially the same way. Standing in opposition is an individualized perspective that highlights the vast differences among individuals' strengths, needs, and goals. It makes sense to construct an education that takes into account these differences among persons. Perhaps, indeed, such an education is fairer. It does not valorize a certain kind of mind, but rather meets each student where he or she is. Okay, so that is the end of the skipping around there. That setup was various bullet points and started off with the punchline and then gave the explication behind that. So I think that goes back to Musashi, as most things do, which is when you see the way broadly, you see it in all things. How can we expect to keep up with an ever-increasing breadth? Knowing one thing robustly will allow the student to know what depth looks like in other formats. So you can teach them about a million different things, but then they just know a million different things. If you teach them one thing and they know it from a million different directions, then that teaches them about the structure of knowledge. How is information layered in the world? How does it stack on top of each other? How far down do rabbit holes go? When you go down the rabbit hole, what happens? There are all these questions that arise from going into one thing. By the way, I misquoted Musashi. I think it's when you see the way broadly, you see it in all things. No, I think that is exactly what I said. Anyway, yeah, you go so deep into one thing and that grants you special knowledge about the structure of knowledge and the structure of information. That's why you get people that are incredibly knowledgeable because they have specialized in one thing. You get someone like Musashi, who essentially specialized in becoming a swordsman, and he learned so many things from that. And then later on in life, he went deeply into art and then deeply into carpentry. And when you read something like the Book of Five Rings, you see how all of those elements, all of those domains in which he became familiar feed into one another and are all structured in exactly the same way, which is how he came up with that quote, is because he went into those multiple domains and he went an inch wide, a mile deep, instead of going a mile deep, inch wide. So that really teaches us about how it is we should structure learning, which is, in my opinion, doing it in such a way where one thing becomes infinitely illustrative to the student. And this doesn't have to be prescribed. Education is not prescription. It's allowing the student to go down whichever path it's going to, and that's really how people choose what it is they're going to do anyway. You know, for example, I am not going to be an AI scientist. Programming is not my thing. I gave it a try for months and was never able to sit down and enjoy it and do it for hours on end and lose my time in it. It was always a struggle to divulge myself into such a pursuit and just lose myself in it and think that, yes, I can do this forever. I could do this every day before and after work and while I'm sleeping, and I would be happy. That's not the case. If it were the case, I'd be doing it. So it's not like there's this hidden programmer somewhere inside of me. If that were the thing that called to me, that is what I would be spending my time doing, but it's not. So and it's really funny because for quite some time, I thought that my calling was game design. I wanted to be a game designer. And that's where I got where I have this experience with seeing what programming could do for me, but programming doesn't do much for me, creatively speaking, in terms of its engagement. So I learned that the hard way. And then when I came to the realization that what it is that calls to me is something literary related, so reading and writing, it suddenly made so much sense to me throughout my childhood. Thinking back on my childhood, I, for some reason, was just always obsessed with stationery. Like, you can't force your mom to do anything, but I would be out with my mom, and for example, we'd be in the dollar store, and there would be this pack. I remember so distinctly, there's a pack of 5 pads you could get. They were like 2-inch by 4-inch small little yellow pads bound together by the wax glue on the top when it was red. And I wanted them because I love stationery. I love just holding stacks of paper, which is maybe why I like reading so much these days. It's just because holding a collection of paper feels good to me. And I would get a pen and I would just scribble on the paper, on the pads, and I would rip off the sheet and then scribble, like how you see in cartoons where it's just somebody making a horizontal scribble along the page, and that's what writing is symbolized as. That's literally what I would do because I enjoyed that process. And it makes so much sense nowadays why I'm into fountain pens and why I like to write every day. And that's what makes me feel real and makes me feel alive. And why I get so much from books is because of that. And also as a kid, I think one time I was really sad because I got an A in spelling. I always got an A+ on the spelling grade on my report card. And I just always excelled in that. And I always had some type of proclivity towards being able to express my thoughts in a way that others would understand. I'm not saying that I'm the most clear, concise, vivid speaker there is out there. Absolutely not. But there was something always about me that I enjoyed presenting in front of classes. I enjoyed using language in some way or another. And I always got the most excited to do essays in class. It wasn't the math. It wasn't the art. It wasn't this or that. It was always the essays. And so once I remember, because I was in the shower when it clicked, it was literally one precise second to the next precise second when I realized standing in the shower that I don't want to be a game designer. That is not what is laid out for me. It is something related to the word. So if in school, I had teachers, as a kid, you can't realize this stuff. Your brain is nowhere even near developed yet. So let's say that I had some excellent teachers along the way, or a single teacher along the way that said, hey, this kid is constantly excelling when it comes to the use of language, and he's doing good in the other categories, but he's especially notable in that. Let's make him do that more. Let's say, hey, when it comes to this, I want you to write me stuff. I want you to read things and tell me what you learn from them. And that would have got me going in that direction. It's just choosing what the student wants to do. Some kids are just math whizzes. And so maybe they're going to go into the STEM field later on. And that's what the teachers should encourage. Now, it is, of course, important to be, I mentioned earlier, a mile wide versus an inch deep, or an inch deep versus a mile, versus an inch wide and a mile deep. So there is, of course, a width there. Even if you are an inch wide and a mile deep, there is a width there. And it's not just the one thing. You need to be like a funnel where you have a whole bunch of stuff that you're aware of that's in the cone part of the funnel. But then there's one thing that you specialize in, and that's what goes down the tube at the end. That's the thing that you really just get, that you really do. It's also referred to as being a T-shaped person. So it's important to have that horizontal bar on the top still. So it's not to ignore math and ignore science and all this other stuff, but to contribute toward that. Because learning facts doesn't do much. Rather, teach how to arrive at facts. And that's the nature of discovery. Now, of course, I have a bit of a bias here because I think that everybody should read and write. That is, if you want to become inordinately strong and purposive in the direction of your life, it is to become literate. And every person benefits from that, no matter what you're doing. But of course, you can go in the direction of dedicating yourself to the word. Intellectual growth on its own right will inspire the love for learning and growth, whereas trying to keep up will lead to feeling perpetually behind. Because if you're going about and you're just teaching new facts as they're discovered, then you're going to feel behind because you're just constantly trying to catch up rather than saying, hey, here's how you love learning so you can grow as the time changes. And then you feel competent. Proclaiming and practicing that all students should be the same leads to students who gain cynicism over not being allowed to fulfill their potential. Because as what happened with me too, as I went through school, I was not very engaged at all. Because I was a student that did not have to do much studying at all to get by. I got A's and B's, and I studied. If there was a test coming up that I knew that was going to be a big test, I would put in maybe a couple hours of studying. But other than that, my strategy was pay attention in class. So I would sit there, I would take notes, I would ask questions, and then when I went home, I did my homework and then played video games or played tennis. So if I were engaged more, and if I, of course, once you start getting into high school, I think, and your brain starts developing more, you can start to make these decisions for yourself, and your parents should help you out too, like seeing where your interests start to direct towards, and then watering those seeds. So I think that's generally what would be a good strategy for education. Back to the book. He's talking about technology and scientific breakthroughs here. In the future, however, actually, let's back up a paragraph. Technological and scientific breakthroughs. The most important technological event of our time is the ascendancy of the computer. I was actually thinking about that yesterday. Just the internet, how the internet is the craziest thing to have been invented. That's a whole nother conversation. Let's continue here. The most important technological event of our time is the ascendancy of the computer. Computers already play a prominent role in many aspects of our lives, from transportation and communication to personal bookkeeping and entertainment. Scarcely oblivious to these trends, many schools now have computers with networking capabilities. Now, to give you some context, this book was written in '99, so a little of his references are going to be dated here. Scarcely oblivious to these trends, many schools now have now have computers with networking capabilities. To some extent, these technological appurtenances have been absorbed into the life of the school, though often they simply deliver the old lessons in a more convenient and efficient format. I actually remember that a lot, is that especially bad teachers, they would just rely on some little program on the computer to give you the same information that they would give you anyway. And when you're getting that information, it's going to be better learned from a human being. It's going to be better learned from a teacher, not just a program on a screen, which kind of sucks. There are also these lazy teachers out there that would say, oh, I would teach you this lesson, but this YouTube video does it better than I do, so I'm just going to play it for you. And hey, I get it. Being a teacher is a hard job that is oftentimes thankless, and even more often, well, definitely not financially rewarding. And also just in terms of crummy students being crummy to teachers. I get that. And you're putting in way more hours than the students are sitting there at the desks. So sometimes you need to say, hey, I'm behind on work. I'm just going to play a video in class today. I would have taught it just about the same in quality anyway. So let me just play this video and I can catch up on grading, or I can catch up on my lesson plan. I get it. It's a tough deal. But I think the response to that is that, well, one, the education system needs to be in greater support of the teachers to provide good lessons. And also, there needs to be better vetting of teachers. Because, yes, there is... So think about the equivalent of this. If I were to create this whole podcast and what I did was just read excerpts from the book, and then that's it, I would say, okay, I thought this paragraph was important. I read you this paragraph. I fast forward 15 pages. This paragraph, I read it, and then just continually do that. That would be almost meaningless. It would really be almost meaningless, because all you're getting at that point is you might as well just read the book. What teachers are there for are the extrapolation. And I was talking to Leah Spiegelman, who was the guest on the previous podcast, which covered the book The Heart of the Buddhist Teachings, with the subtitle, I believe, Transforming Suffering into I almost said Truth, Beauty, and Goodness, but transforming suffering into, I forgot what it was into, but it's good things that you would want suffering to transform into. And I was asking her, because of her degree in psychology, how much of that do you actually need to go through school for? Right? Like, how much, if I just looked at the lesson plan for all of those classes, and I looked at the required readings and the optional readings and then some more on top of that, could I just read my way through a bachelor's in psychology? Could I just read my way through a master's in psychology? And I think it would be absurd to say up to a doctorate, but her response was that, no, you can't do that, because what you get is not just the knowledge from the required readings or assignments that you do that you could just replicate on your own time. It's from being there with the educators and having their life experience and clinical experience, and how that contributes to their extrapolation of what is in the books that has this raw data. It's like, essentially, if imagine your brain, everything you see and understand is filtered through the brain, and as a progenitor of that through your experiences. So if you went through life and everything you saw and everything you heard was recorded in its raw data, you would just go mentally insane, because your brain can't keep up with all of that. It has to filter a lot of it out. And what you experience in your active conscious life is that filtered through knowledge. And so that's essentially what the educators did. And that's why she said getting the actual degree was important. It's also the experience that you get in your different internships and things that you participate in, programs that you participate in. So back to the book, I didn't even get to what I highlighted here. So here we go. In the future, however, education will be organized largely around the computer. Not only will much of instruction and assessment be delivered by computer, but the habits of mind fostered by computer interactions will be highlighted, while those that fall through the computational cracks may be lost. For example, precise, explicit, step-by-step thinking is likely to be enhanced, while fine-grained aesthetic or ethical judgments may be marginalized. Wow, that's an incredible comment there. I think about that in a very real sense, because he used the right word here, which is habit. And that's the right word because you can develop fine-grained aesthetic and ethical judgments, and you can develop explicit step-by-step thinking by performing one habit or another. And it'll be very unfortunate if, I don't know what education is like these days. I'm sure given the recent COVID-19 pandemic, an even greater emphasis has been placed on computer interactions. Necessarily. And I'm sure those have far-reaching implications, but I hope one of the long-term adoptions of that is not the fact that the computer can do a good job. Not that we should rely on that. And I don't say that out of an old-fashioned, we need it back in my old day type of argument, but in the fact that humans learn through human interaction. And when you get rid of the human, you get rid of the meaning. Because imagine this, you stick a newborn into a room and all it has is a computer and a monitor and a keyboard and a mouse. And you have that child try and learn things about the world. Is that going to be better or worse than if once a week you put a different person in the room with that baby until it's the age of, well, let's say when education typically ends, which is 18 years old, at least in the United States? What do you think is going to have a greater impact? And I think bringing it to the dichotomous extremes really highlights what is more meaningful here. What is more important? What's going to be more efficient? What's going to be what's going to be better for humanity in the long term? And I'm tempted to agree with all of the things he's saying about computer reliance, which of course I do in a lot of ways, but because computers are so versatile, it's easily possible for them to challenge aesthetics and ethics more adroitly and with more nuance than what everyday situations would allow. So, for example, just look at monumental video games. And there are video games out there that can convey things about truth, beauty, and goodness that the classroom simply can't teach. And that's because in a digital environment, when you're having digital interactions, you can create things that can never happen in the real world. And those fictional or otherwise somehow abstract environments, mental environments, cognitive, creative, moral, ethical environments, teach you something. For example, it's definitely top three. I think it is my third favorite video game of all time. I think number one is Dark Souls. Number two is probably Mass Effect. That's the game that I have the most amount of hours in. I believe I have the equivalent of approximately 50 days played in that game, quite a few hours. And my third favorite is Shadow of the Colossus. Now, this game features in popular media in the movie Reign Over Me, which features a role seriously played by I can't believe it's Sam something. He was in the movie Click. He always plays these, Adam Sandler. He always plays these silly roles, but this is a movie where he played an actual serious role and blew it out of the water. I think he's actually a great actor, but just, I don't know. That's what he enjoys more is doing the silly roles. And they misquoted it in the movie. He called it Shadows of the Colossus, which is, I think, it's rather bad, making that singular versus plural mistake. Anyway, I think it goes to show something here because in Mass Effect, I have 50 days played. In Shadow of the Colossus, I have played it once and refused to replay it because there's too much beauty and truth in that game. There's so much that it conveys that replaying it will actually only muddy my experience with it and my memory of it and everything like that. Because essentially it's a game, it's not your typical game that you go through your levels, you have your 3 lives, and you finish the level. It's a game where it's essentially all boss battles. It's 16 boss battles, and then you have the final boss. And it's in this huge world, and you are this dude, and you go around on a horse. And there's barely any dialogue. There's actually no dialogue. There's only monologue from one kind of abstract being that you can communicate with at various points throughout the game. So it's which means when it's all boss battles in this environment that you're riding through on your horse, you're either in a boss battle or you're galloping through fields and deserts on a horse. And you get time to reflect, you get time to think. And when you're going through, when you're galloping around, there's no music. There's music during the boss battles, but and during the very few cutscenes in the game, but other than that, there's pretty much no music. So you're just silently galloping. And how many games give you so much free, silent time? So there's so much that you can learn from that game, and I won't give it away. But there are things about digital interactions that you simply can't get from books because they're experiential. That's what I love about video games. It's a medium separated from books and movies and TV and everything else because it's the only one you can interact with, and how your decisions change what's going to happen. So I agree with Gardner on the reliance on computational interactions, but that's not to say that they are not valuable in any way. Pedagogically, personally, everythingly. Moving on here, back to the book. Computer technology puts all the information in the world at one's fingertips, quite literally. This is both a blessing and a curse. No longer do we have to spend long periods of time hunting down a source or a person. These can be reached essentially instantaneously. Indeed, soon we will not even have to type in an instruction in order to learn the capital of Montana, the population of Korea, or Ohm's law. We will just be able to ask out loud and the computer will print out or speak the answer. Thus, people will achieve instant, quote, cultural literacy. So this is one thing that I've had a bit of a change of opinion on. When I was in middle school and high school, I didn't have a this was during the age when smartphones were becoming to be a thing. When I was in middle school was when people were starting to get the first iPhones and stuff like that. And I was like, oh man, I was still there with my flip phone. And I was a little bit jealous of that for some time. Of course, in the long term, I'm grateful for my parents. My children aren't getting a smartphone until later on, because for a whole nother topic that may be worth its own podcast, or maybe if I end up doing a book on technology somehow. And that was one thing I really loved, because I would be on Xbox Live playing online video games with my friend, and I would be curious about something. He had a smartphone, so and the family computer was not in my bedroom. So I'd say, "Yo, can you look up this thing for me?" When I wanted a quick answer to something, and that was really valuable to me. But now I value so much more going into a book and saying, you know what, I'm not going to get the quick answer. Let me read a whole book about that and highlight it and annotate it and make a podcast on it. And then I'm going to actually learn about it. I'm not just going to know the fact that's Googleable. And this is why breadth is largely perfunctory in contemporary culture. Knowledge is instantly acceptable, or shall I say information? I think there's a difference. So it is depth which must be acquired the old-fashioned way. It is the depth that you cannot get easily. It's the depth that you can't get from a Google answer. Now you can look up a Musashi quote, like when you see the way broadly you see it in all things. Or sorry, it is when you know the way broadly you see it in all things. I can't believe I was getting that wrong. And you can read that quote, and that comes after decades of the legendary life of a samurai or of a ronin in the 1400s. But does that mean you really got the depth? Just because you got the quote at the tail end of somebody else's depth? No. What you got to do is not just learn what the master knows. You got to learn how the master learned. You have to say, hey, what did you do to get to that point? And you don't just hear the point from him. You actually go through the same process that he did in your own domain. I'm not going to be a master swordsman. I'm not going into fencing anytime soon. But I can look at the life of Musashi, see the things that he sought, and seek those myself. Back to the book. I recently heard a claim that the amount of information in the world doubles every 80 days. And even if those figures are largely meaningless, does disinformation count as information? What counts as information anyway? The reality that they're attempting to quantify makes it more difficult to determine what truth is worth studying and what is worth living by. In the future, the individual or intelligent agent who can examine these bodies of knowledge and determine what is worth knowing will be at a tremendous premium. Even more estimable will be the person or browser who or that can synthesize the exponentially expanding domains of knowledge so that vital information could be made available in useful form to the average citizen and the average policymaker. Boom. That's what I have to say to that one. And that's actually what encourages me. That's what makes me feel encouraged to do what I'm doing now, which is reading, annotating, and sharing what I see in the books that I read. Because to me, that's what this is. This is listening to a podcast, whether it's from someone reading from a book or from their own knowledge or whatever it is. It's synthesizing knowledge and extracting the vital information so that the average citizen can get it. And the more of that there is, the better. Because does that run contrary to what I was just saying about trying to see the light at the end of the tunnel without actually walking through the tunnel? A little bit. But not entirely, because there's a difference between getting the whole picture of how something is synthesized versus just getting the end result. And when you're getting that larger picture of how things are being synthesized, how information is being synthesized, then that allows for you to, when you see the process, you can apply that process across various domains and at multiple levels of abstraction. And this has me think then that I'm it reifies my own path in a way. So it's kind of motivating there. And on the same page, he says this: the question of interdisciplinary study proves timely. At the beachheads, most problems do not readily fit into neat disciplinary niches. Teams of interdisciplinary workers are the norm, and the most effective investigators are those who are able to judiciously to combine the insights and techniques of two or more disciplines. No easy task when the disciplines themselves are rapidly changing. And that's what genius is. I've talked about this before, I've wrote about this before. That is, and so has every other person who has anything meaningful to say over the course of history, is that what you do when you create something that is genius, something that is unique, something that other people think is worthy of their attention and time, is when you take two disparate concepts and you unite them into a path that others can identify and see the value of. Each subject in school should be taught as it relates to all others, as well as why and how it is relevant to the student's life, because if it's taught in the same way as before, the relevance will be undoubtedly antiquated and irrelevant. If you're reading from the seventh revision of a book that was written 10 years ago, and the only thing that changed was some terms in it to make it more politically correct to current year, what's that actually doing to your education? Nothing at all. The problems and concerns of the current life are different for each student as they go through it, because they live in a different time. So it's understanding, how is what happened in the past relevant to right now? And how is right now relevant to you? That should be the course that is taken. Back to the book. I must admit that the picture I've given is a bit of a caricature. Probably only zealots believed these views in as unmodulated a form as I've presented them. Moreover, few teachers or parents subscribed explicitly to the views of either behaviorist or trait psychologists. They are much more pragmatic about what they believed and did, yet their practices, from tracking youngsters on the basis of test scores to holding frequent spelling bees and awarding gold stars, reflected the pervasive and often insidious power of these imports from laboratory psychology. So, to me, isn't this just self-fulfilling prophecy? The Pygmalion effect, as it's known? And just as many companies detriment from internal competition, wouldn't it be more ideal to promote cooperation? In the classroom, irrespective of age, when a student is somehow competent or knowledgeable, have them instruct others. So this is not about taking a test and doing well, or beating others in a competition. It's, hey, this person is really good at spelling and understanding. Well, maybe if they're good at spelling doesn't mean they're necessarily good at understanding grammatical structure and the such, but something they have is valuable to others. So what that means is that these little groups should be developed such that they can rely on one another and they can learn, hey, everybody's good at something. I got to find out what that thing is for me. And they can see, oh, Susan is teaching me about spelling. Okay, maybe I can teach Susan about why evolution makes sense, because she doesn't quite grasp that. And it's this interdependence that I think should develop in the classroom as well as in the workplace too, because it is in the workplace where there are lots and lots of hard skills that should be developed and need to be developed in order to perform the best as can be expected, and actually to exceed those expectations. Back to the book. The developmental perspective. Thanks to the pioneering work of the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, we no longer believe that young children are just miniature or ignorant adults. Rather, children are credited with their own characteristic ways of representing the world. The infant's world is one of sensory perceptions and actions. The toddler's world features various kinds of symbols, such as words and pictures, for the first time. The young school child is able to deal with concepts such as amount and time, as long as these concepts are encountered in concrete, tangible form. And he goes on, well, I'll finish that here. The adolescent is able to reason abstractly about the same concepts and words and through the manipulation of logical symbols without needing to refer constantly to tangible objects or displays. Now, what I highlighted there was 3 words, which is young school child, and time. And the reason why is because as soon as a child is able to understand time is when they really should be taught about it. That what time is. What does it mean for you to go through time? What does it mean for time to pass? I remember Sam Harris has a podcast, I believe, covering the book that Anaka Harris, his wife, had written. And she was one time constructing a meditation session with children, and these are children in the single digits, and very young. And one of the boys one time said to her rather cryptically at first, "It goes by so fast." She said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Time." And it's true, which is, I think, why more children should be familiarized with mindfulness and also meditation, is that it does go by fast. It goes by so fast, it feels like the next second has already happened. And when there's that pervading sense throughout all of life forever, you kind of need to be inculcated to that. Otherwise, it's going to pass you by. This is when, because it is at the earliest point, to start instructing children on the use of time. The fact that, yes, it is always passing, and how you spend it now, and its effects on their future. You know, eating a tasty meal now means later you'll have to do the dishes. Also, with every good, there is also some bad. So teaching them that too, teaching them, hey, there is what's good now, and there is what has to be dealt with as a consequence of that. It is 2 parts in all ways. Back to the book. At the end of the day, people are not computers. And so in the last several years, cognitivists have proposed various models on how emotions can structure, guide, and influence mental representations. All point to a simple truth. If one wants something to be attended to, mastered, and subsequently used, one must be sure to wrap it in a context that engages the emotions. Conversely, experiences devoid of emotional impact are likely to be weakly engaging and soon forgotten, leaving nary a mental representation behind. Find some way to make it personally meaningful. To maximize the staying power of some idea, identify how it's personally relatable, and in a way that makes you feel. The absence of feeling is the absence of learning, and therefore changing. That's why when I go through, when I annotate these books, I don't just highlight what looks like it should be, like, oh, that would be a good definition. That's a classic kind of school studying life. Is you say, oh, you're reading through the textbook and you're reading through all the crap, is what you think about it as. You're reading through all the crap, and then all of a sudden comes the italicized vocabulary word, the italicized term. and you say, okay, let me highlight that, let me study that, I'll memorize that, whatever, I'll read the rest of the paragraph, but that's what I need to learn. And that's what we're taught, which sucks. There are important concepts which have to be highlighted. Or sorry, no, before I meant physically highlighting it with ink, with a highlighter. There are certainly concepts that have to be pointed out, but at the same time, those have to be embedded in what it means to understand that concept as a whole. So maybe in the context of the classroom, you could say, okay, students, when you come to class tomorrow, learn the definitions of these 4 words. They come to class, maybe 30% of them will actually cover those definitions. And what you do is you say, you outline what they are, you contextualize them and how they're meaningful, and then you relate it to their lives. And you say, this is why you need to learn these things, because they will help you be the person that you more want to be tomorrow. They are that immediately helpful to you. And back to the book. To focus on culture is not to deny psychology or biology. Each of these vantage points is necessary. Schools in general, and equally schools worthy of emulation, are the product of their society and culture. Its goals, its values, its ways of making and interpreting meanings. Perhaps less dramatically, but equally decisively, these milieus, with their unique histories and values, determine what is likely, what is possible, and what is not going to happen in the education of their children. So, the classroom is a place to instill the cultural and societal expectations of that area and ensure that each student intends to explore the world with curiosity. It is not strictly a place for facts. Because schools are embedded in culture, in society, in government, in politics, and all of these things, in art, school touches all things. And so therefore, should populate everyday learnings with elements that are relevant to all of those domains. Continuing on here, back to the book. Certainly it would be possible to have an education that honored both the Suzuki and the Spectrum milieus, but only if one recognized the quite different poles of the cultural traditions from which they initially arise. The respect for art and craft is greater in the East Asian milieu, while the appeal of a variety of initially engaging materials reflects a contemporary Western perspective. The intensive supporting role played by mothers in East Asia would have to be assumed by some adults in the West. If the Suzuki method were to be effective, By the same token, adult Japanese would have to become far more oriented toward individual goals and needs, toward the ways in which each child differs from his peers and requires her own bridging. If the spirit of Spectrum were to be more imported to a culture that has been predominantly oriented toward harmonious relations within the group. So he's talking there about the East versus the West, the different education methods, how in the West it's essentially more individualistic and greater, with that greater breadth, whereas in the Japanese culture, as represented by the Suzuki method of thinking, that the Japanese would have to come to understand more the significance and importance of the individual. So the question here is that, is it possible for a Western teacher to assume both roles in order to administer the best, quote unquote, the best education? Presumably the best would be a marriage between competence equaling confidence. There's the competence equals confidence Eastern approach, as well as allowing unmitigated curiosity, as does the West. Those are really the difference there, because the Suzuki method is more focused on you're going to be good at this thing and you're going to do it until you're good at it. And I do believe that competence equals confidence. That's why it's important to be good at something, because then you can be confident generally as you go through life. But it's also important to have that really wide-ranging curiosity of how do frickin' things work? And it's important to look at how many things work, because when you know the way broadly, you see it in all things. So when you know something really well, when you know the way, and you look at other areas where that's featured, you're going to be able to better understand your own specialization, your own singular way. Back to the book. Particularly in a diverse society, the aim of producing a single polity, e pluribus unum, constitutes a deep and enduring value dating back to Horace Mann's Common School of the 1840s. However, a core curriculum reflects American values in another way. American educational institutions often judge their efficacy by the number of facts mastered, concepts introduced, specific behavioral objectives achieved. Americans love to count and keep track of how many things have been learned. Newspapers, as well as school boards, focus on behaviors that are deemed desirable and can be measured. And less happily, in my admittedly prejudiced view, these institutions often accept superficial evidence as proof of learning. Our intoxication with television quiz and game shows has affinities with one salient view of what public education ought to be like. And it's really true. There is this societal intoxication, as he says, of what it means to learn something. And I think a great example of this was this American game show called Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? And it took information that was covered in your average American fifth grade class, which is elementary school. And at that age, you're probably, 10 years old in 10th grade, something like that. So it would get adults and face them against these children. And the entertainment was in seeing how miserably the adults failed fifth grade knowledge. But that's because there is just facts that adults didn't care to remember. And some of them should have been memorized more easily than others. But that just comes down to just basic knowledge that everyone should know. But other than that, it is this emphasis on facts. And that is kind of, in a way, the difference between the East and the West, where the West has this more extroverted, which is to say a more outward focus on how is something true, which is to say, oh, okay, you're saying something, you're making a claim. Can you triple back that up with 3 different types of evidence and have that corroborated by this, and that? No, like, yes, that's important. And that is one of the pillars of science, and that is what has gotten us so far in the scientific realm. But we also need that Eastern introverted approach to understanding something, which is, how do I internally verify this? How do I look inside myself? How do I cross-check this with my unconscious life to see if something like this is going to hold up in day-to-day life? Is this going to be meaningful to me and others? Exactly one of the major problems within American education is what he's talking about here. Why aren't students encouraged to learn on the basis of showing that they've learned by extemporaneous means? On paper isn't good enough, and that's all America expects, unfortunately. So what I mean by extemporaneous means there is, okay, you've learned this information, and then the test isn't can you fill in the correct bubble on the test, but rather, hey, can you give a short response in the form of 2 sentences that shows that you understand this? Or can you sit down with me for, maybe that's what the test is. It's, you have 25 students in your class, you have a 50-minute class, you sit down with each student for 2 minutes, that isn't quite enough, really, because then they're switching between students, one just transitioning from one student to the next. So you come up with some method. Maybe you stretch it across multiple days, and some students have one day over another, or you do it in small groups, and you see how can these students communicate their ideas effectively, and how can they communicate that, and just sitting down with them and having a conversation, because that's going to be the way to evaluate if a student is actually learning the stuff, is if they can reproduce it in a way that's logical and applies to their own life. Maybe something that would be good is putting them in groups, and you layer it very intentionally, and you say, okay, let's take a group of 4 students, or maybe even 6 students would be good. And you say, this is the topic that we learned about today. Let's say we learned about D-Day in World War II. And you have 2 groups of, let's just go with 2 students. You have these 2 students confer, and they talk amongst each other, and they come up with a singular idea of what was important about D-Day. Maybe it was the deception that the American side, the Allied forces displayed in breaking through the German forces. Maybe it was the faults in the German assessment of where attacks were going to come from. Maybe it was in how the training occurred for the soldiers. Maybe it was how the esprit de corps was established, so that these brave young men can climb a cliff and then charge a front line, possibly dying immediately, but knowing they're doing it for the right cause. There are a million angles to take this from. Putting that to a single idea, communicating that to Group B, to these 2 students, and then Group B does that to Group A, and the test, the evaluation that the teacher carries out is, what was the idea that Group A expressed, and is that something meaningful to say, and does it seem like they understand what they're talking about? And perhaps that would be 50% of the grade, and the other 50% of the grade is, how well did they summarize Group B's opinion or Group B's perspective on the matter? So you have this element of teams working together to understand each other. And then you also have, how do we take information from the outside? And not only how do I summarize that in a way that makes sense, so you have to understand what they're saying and listen intently. You also have that human interaction of engaging with another person and trying to, steel man them, give them the benefit of the doubt, and pull something meaningful out of them. And then not only do you have to do that, but you have to do that with another person. You have to say, hey, other person in Group A with me, what do you think Group B was trying to say there? Oh, I think they were trying to say X, Y, and Z. That's interesting. I thought they were trying to say A, B, and C. So then you have this interplay of trying to negotiate and compromise and agree on what this information coming in to you actually means. So yeah, it's super important to definitely to have those types of engagements. And is that difficult to do in a contemporary education setting? Yes. Is it important and meaningful, and ultimately will ultimately fructify the efforts of the entire educational system? I also think that's true. Moving on. Another flawed approach is to paper over the differences within a community and try to please all interest groups. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. The solution is particularly appealing in cases when various cultures or warring camps all clamor for recognition. Since no one wants to come down too hard on anyone else, the evident solution, though it ends up being patchwork at best, is to make sure that every interest group is represented, either equally or proportionally. We see this everywhere. Even in workplaces, diversity is frequently advertised as a necessary ingredient, and though it is, it can be mishandled. The presence of diversity does not necessarily hold hands with all that diversity brings. A foundational element of encouraging new ideas is paramount. So diversity brings about the better capacity to have more meaningful ideas, because that means that they've been in some sense cross-referenced with a variety of perspectives, and that therefore reinforces the webbing to how true, good, and beautiful something can be. But it's also a matter of just the ideas itself. You know, for example, we're pushing for equal representation in different fields, and this is a bit of a political take here. We're looking for equal representation in a field like STEM, and I think they're actually trying to convert that into STEAM now, by science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. Because, hey, what's the difference at the end of the day? And saying we want equal representation, whether it's in sex, whether it's in race, whether it's this or that, ethnicity, sexual orientation. But how far does that go? For example, do we want equal representation in construction workers? Do we want as many women as men? Or if we strive towards that, would that be something worth our time? Or is it better off just having the proportion of men and women in construction right now be the same? And that also influences, that goes back to policy too, because there are things like affirmative action and affirmative action in terms of essentially getting more people of color into the workplace. Maybe there is something about diversity that is so worth it that we need to do that. But look at what it actually is. That's saying we are going to give you different opportunities based on the color of your skin. That seems like blatant racism to me. How is that not blatant racism? Is we are going to literally give you a different privilege because you look different. And like I said, maybe there is something so powerful and so culturally purposive and propelling about having more people of color in the workplace that we should intentionally, through action and through policy, get us closer to that. But what does that come at the sacrifice of when it comes to racism? Because that's racism. So there's a very delicate interplay there. Maybe it's not at one extreme or the other and somewhere in between. If it is somewhere in between, which it likely is, as all things are, where is that in between? I really don't know. I don't know enough about race and about politics and all of the societal and cultural implications of that to really make a judgment call on it. Those are at least the things that stand out to me, though, whatever they mean in the bigger picture of things. Back to the book here. A helpful analogy can be drawn from the arts and athletics. People would smirk, rightly, if the mastery of a young art student, musician, or athlete were assessed in the examination hall on a Saturday morning with a standardized paper and pencil or computerized test. Rather, what typically happens in these realms is illuminating. From the start of their training, youngsters observe more proficient, usually older individuals performing the required actions and understandings, playing new pieces of music, practicing dance steps, engaged in scrimmages and in games against tough and wily opponents. The youngsters can see the moves that must be mastered. They can try them out, they can monitor their improvement and compare it with that of peers, and they can benefit from timely coaching. In an quote understanding class or school, A similar ambience is created. Novices see older students and teachers engaged in performances which they ultimately must carry out, writing essays, mounting oral arguments, debating with one another, explaining scientific phenomena, carrying out experiments, creating and critiquing works of art. So this is great because this goes exactly to what we're talking about a couple points ago, which is not just having them fill in a bubble on a multiple choice test. This is almost anything that is worth learning is worth doing so through a qualitative route. There is explicit book studying and book smarts you need to do to become proficient in everything, in anything. You even hear the greatest military minds throughout history. And you think of military minds as you're going out and you're shooting guns at people. You don't need to be smart for that, but you need to be incredibly well educated for that. This is when you're dealing with the lives of human beings. You better be able to exercise creativity on a level that is vastly superior to so many other people out there in the world, because lives are literally at stake, and more immediately and instantly than almost any other realm there is out there. So it's important even for that. So you hear people from Napoleon to David Hackworth saying, be well read, being educated, do your research. It's important, but you're not going to get the full picture of how something should be done just by taking a test on it, or seeing if a person is competent at that just by taking a test on it. Just as an exemplary leader is an exemplary grunt, an exemplary teacher is an exemplary student. A teacher, especially of younger ones, ought to outclass every student so that the youngsters can participate in something akin to an apprenticeship and gain knowledge and competence in the desired domain. So it's not just about the teacher saying, hey, this textbook is important, you're going to read it, and then you're going to be smart, and you're going to take a test on it, and I'm going to teach you at it. You're going to get learned at. No. If a teacher is saying that, they need to do that every day too. They need to demonstrate that. You know, it would be important, perhaps, I'm imagining if I were a teacher and I wanted to demonstrate the importance of reading. I want to say, hey, reading is important. Everyone should read every day. It is just as you should exercise every day, because that is essential to physical health. You need to read every day because that's essential for mental health. So if I walked in every day, I had my book in hand, and, you know, every day I get 1, 2, maybe 3 parts of what I read that morning that I found important. So I highlight it and I annotate it. And if I started the first 5 minutes of every class saying, hey, this is something cool I learned today, and then I read the quote and I read the sticky, and I say, hey, does anybody else have thoughts about that? And then we have a little discussion. Maybe that discussion lasts the first 15 minutes of class. And maybe that's more important than the actual lesson for that day, is the discussion that we have, because we're talking about something interesting that the students actually care about, rather than slogging through a lesson. So it is demonstrating, hey, I'm saying you should read every day. I'm saying literacy is a superpower. This is what I'm doing on that end every single day. And that's kind of what I'm doing through my Instagram, is posting my highlights and annotations, because I want to prove that I believe literacy is a superpower, and I want to demonstrate that I subscribe to the power and divinity of that principle so strongly that I do it every day, and I'm not going to hide from that fact. So that is why I make those posts on Instagram. And you see something like Jocko saying, wake up early and sort your life out, is essentially what he says. And what does he do? He posts photo every day of his watch at 4:32 a.m. because he talks about waking up early and getting done what you need to get done. So he demonstrates to the world that that's what he does. And that's the literary equivalent of what I believe in. And it's really funny that I mentioned David Hackworth as a offhand example, because that's coming up in this next quote, which in this next excerpt from the book, which I'll like to read here. The book doesn't reference David Hackworth, but my annotation does. So back to the book. Goals must come first, and they must be kept in mind, but there are also important other players. Let me now introduce the other members of the ideal cast. Well-trained, enthusiastic teachers. To teach for understanding, the teachers themselves must be comfortable with and understand the material. Teachers need to feel expert, and they need to embody expertise in the eyes of their students. They must also believe that understanding is important to be prepared to embody that understanding in their own lives. Nothing more impresses students than the opportunity to see informed adults make apt use of the material being introduced. That is why young musicians love to watch their teachers perform, and tennis students want to play with their instructors. And that is why students soon become disenchanted with teachers who fail to walk the talk. Oh my God. Oh my God. Not only is this exactly the point that I was just making, but it's also exactly referencing David Hackworth in his book About Face, because on pages 402 and 403 of About Face, he gives the bulleted list of what one of his leaders once spoke of, which is just how to be a good leader. And one of them was essentially Glover Johns saying, showmanship is essential in every leader. For the student / apprentice / subordinate, seeing the professed theory put into practice is magical and inspires hope that he too one day can fly so high. There's an example of Glover Johns. Everyone was lined up one day, and one of the lower level soldiers was holding his rifle, and I forgot what it's called, but when people in the military do those demonstrations with their rifle where they're spinning it and throwing it in the air and doing all this other stuff, that they do that for a variety of reasons. But one day he walked along and said, "Hey, he said, throw me your M16. So the soldier threw it to Glover Johns, and he said, this is how it should be done. And he did the whole cadence and all the maneuvers essentially perfectly, threw it back to the soldier and said, that's basically how it goes. Something like that, more or less. And it's because showmanship is important. It's because when you see a leader or a teacher or whoever it is, and they say, this is how you should do things, and then they also demonstrate that they can do it to an extreme competence, then it's like, wow, I really need to get on track. I really need to get on track here. So that's why it's important when you say something as a teacher, you have to live it. That's why I say all the time that being a leader is not from 9 to 5. You need to live that in your everyday life. If you say that X, Y, and Z is important, you need to do X, Y, and Z every day, or at least when it's relevant. Super important. Back to the book here. Offering apt analogies. Unfamiliar topics or themes are often first grasped by analogy to a topic that is better known or understood. Models drawn from familiar territory can also help students gain a first understanding of an unfamiliar terrain. Of course, every analogy has strengths and weaknesses, since by definition, analogies and models are drawn from remote realms. There will be important differences as well as telling similarities between the unfamiliar topic and the more accessible vehicle being used to illuminate it. Instructors must convey the power of the analogy. No less, they must indicate its limitations and the ways in which it might mislead. So this is why learning across a variety of disciplines is necessary in the role of the educator. Providing a view which is a composite of many views is the best way to inculcate youngsters with a fascination with learning. So when you say, hey, how you care about ice cream is why World War II is important. if you could be so daring and so able to draw that to draw that comparison, is going to be the best way to have students be engaged in what's in the day-to-day learnings of the classroom. So a little bit of a simple point there. Moving on. Gardner uses a few examples throughout this book as really mainstays, and he uses one as representation of the truth, which is the theory of evolution, another as the representation of beauty, which is the marriage of Figaro, and also as one of goodness, which is the Holocaust, in the 1940s. So that's the background to why he's talking about the Holocaust here. So back to the book. The Holocaust presents the most extreme human attributes: hatred, cruelty, evil, power used maliciously, some instances of courage and decency. It compels us to consider how a nation could come to the point where genocide became state policy, and how specific individuals could, sometimes eagerly, become the vehicles of that policy. It raises equally profound questions about what civilization is. The idea of genocide took form in a nation that many people considered the pinnacle of civilization. The plan was vetted by individuals holding doctorates from major universities, and the murders were carried out by individuals who somehow managed at the same time to pursue interests in literature, art, music, and religion. And especially for all those who were personally involved in the events, the Holocaust raises the most fundamental questions of meaning. How can one find reasons for living in the face of such horrible human actions? Herein lies the urgency of writings by Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, and other survivors. Other survivors, I think I'd like to add there, Viktor Frankl. I covered his book, also Man's Search for Meaning. I think that was episode 3. One of the most important books of the 20th century. I recently also finished The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. That's also World War II. That's more the Russian side of World War II rather than the German side of World War II. And they're very different perspectives. And it's really weird too, because when you think about them, they're on the opposite extremes, even of how they're represented. Man's Search for Meaning is like a 130-page book. You could literally finish it. You could finish it in a few days easily, with a little bit of reading every day. Whereas the Gulag Archipelago is a 650-page behemoth, and that's only one of 3 volumes. So they're represented in totally different ways. And I guess that's the end of my point there. That's just an interesting part of it. There's something to look at here from the lessons learned from survivors. Your meaning is good enough. Maintaining meaning at a time like that is much more difficult than my struggles. Right? Think about what these people were going through in the 40s, like Viktor Frankl and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, versus what I'm going through right now. But don't feel guilty, because after all, a gas expands. Make space for suffering as to not have it banging on the doors of other goods in life. Now, what I said there rather cryptically, a gas expands, and that's because in Man's Search for Meaning, that's what Viktor Frankl talks about referencing suffering, which is to say that in a room, when you fill it with gas, the gas will equally distribute among the room, no matter how big the room is. The same amount of gas is going to be equally distributed in a chamber, whether it's a big chamber or a small chamber. So what that means is, well, what I learned from it is be respectful of others. You know, it's hard to sometimes relate to younger people where they had another student in class that was being mean to them or bullied them or called them something. And you could say, bruh, grow up. This is the littlest thing in the world to be concerned about right now. But that is their world. That is literally their world. So when you talk to other people, whether they're young school children or people your age or people much older than you, respect their experience and respect that whatever their suffering is, you know, that is the full equally distributed version of their suffering. That is what they're seeing. So be respectful of that. That's what I learned from it. And also that your meaning is your meaning. Everybody has a different meaning, and it's something to respect. Back to the book. Finally, particularly work like Figaro also lends itself to comparisons. The imbroglios in this 18th century social tableau are reminiscent of other complex plots. For example, the Los Angeles-based movie plots of The Big Sleep in Chinatown. The relation among scenes and acts resembles the courses of a long meal, major courses interspersed with shorter palate cleansers as well as periods for conversation or dancing, and pieces like the trio recall particular events of life. There are times when rumors lack proof and yet have the aura of truth. There are times when each of several acquaintances is playing with the same basic elements, say ideas rather than notes, and yet none is ever cognizant of that fact. It seems that this structure defines an engaging narrative. I like the idea of using the same thing and getting different places. I suppose like the concept of honor in Musashi, where you can have this concept that is propagated throughout a tale in many different ways, and in each context means something different. So that's the valuable thing about reading a book, is it is both an explication on a lot of things at once, because of course there are many pages to a book. At the same time, it's a single concept. For example, in this one, we're getting how multiple intelligences plays into the education system and what we can do to go about improving that. So that is the essential element here, and it's essential in the sense that it can be executed in every domain, whether you're reading a book or playing Shadow of the Colossus or having a conversation. It is understanding how it is that one thread weaves itself through the entire garment, so to speak. So back to the book here. This is a part that I'm actually not going to read in terms of an exact excerpt, but more of these subpoints, because he's talking about this section is labeled battle scars and occasional medals, and he's talking about what it means to be a good educator, essentially. And he says, let me mention some of the principal lessons, cautionary and occasionally inspiring, that I've learned. And I'm just going to read you the titles of these subpoints. 1, they're not numbered, but I'll just number them for the sake of ease. 1, the importance of leadership. 2, the need for long-term perspective. 3, the need for flexibility and small victories. 4, Anticipate setbacks and be prepared to deal with them. 5, allow time for reflection. 6, build on strengths. 7, pay attention to implicit messages in the institutional culture. I forgot what number I was on. Did I just say 6? Next is create a community that cares. Visit and be visited. Cultivate new energies. Commit yourself to the process of change. And it's crazy how, I think it was because at the time I was reading this, I was really in the leadership mindset. But it's also true irrespective of that, because it's crazy how these concepts are the same everywhere. You know, the importance of leadership, that's extreme ownership, as is in the words of Jocko Willink, and step back and make a call, as he also says, which is the need for the long-term perspective. You need to be able to assess what's going on, not just in the here and now, and do small things well. That's the small victories. The small things well is one of the things that I mentioned Colonel Glover Johns earlier. That was one of the bullet points in his list, which was strive to do small things well. And another is cover and move that Jocko mentions, which is reflective in create a community that cares and such, and take care and put your feet up and think. That's another thing Glover John says. What is that? Allow time for reflection. What else? Take care of your men. That's another common thing in the military. And what is that? Pay attention to the implicit messages of the institutional culture and create a community that cares, and all of this stuff. Cultivate new energies. That's what this is saying. Leadership is the same everywhere at every time. And it's really empowering to read that, because that means that these concepts are functionally universal. So, back to the book here. This is the topic where he's talking about scaling up. 3 helpful ingredients. And it's in terms of scaling up the consideration for education and what we have to do, and how do we get policymakers involved on this train ride in order to make these differences. So this is in the last subsection of scaling up. 3 helpful ingredients. The first is a clearly articulated program. The second is a consistently held focus. And the last one here is what I'm going to read out, which is conviction that one is involved in a movement. Reform can be a lonely undertaking, and the feeling that one is engaged in a solitary uphill fight can be discouraging, even devastating. Progress is more likely to occur within schools or across networks of schools, and scaling up is more likely to become a reality if the players feel that they belong to something important, and if they secure the emotional rewards that come from engagement with a cause. The fatal limitation of a carrot and stick approach to school reform is that this behaviorist track ignores what motivates human behavior in the long run, a feeling that one is engaged in something of consequence, and a belief that what one does matters to the community, to the students, to oneself. Every person needs a why. Every person needs a why in order to participate in one of these causes and to feel significant to it, and for the cause to feel significant to the person. Give meaning, and followers will give back. Which is to say that when you embark on something that is worthy of the time spent doing it, that is when other people will recognize that and follow in those footsteps. That's what revolutions are, and cultural upheavals and changes and the such. It is when one person thinks something should be done in a different way, and then another person, and then 2 other people, and then 200,000 other people, or whatever the scale is of this movement. And nothing holds significance without a significant personal why. This is your path. This is your way. This is your guiding force. This is what tells you how to do what you're doing, why you're doing it, and with what consequences. And choosing the right consequences. It's all embedded in that. To relate that to what I find significant, a movement, not so much a movement, more of a practice to jump on. It is for me, the way is to relate to as many other people as I can in order to understand them. Because people like being understood and people want to be understood. And there's something powerful with that, because when you establish a connection of mutual understanding, that's where you get the most meaningful relationships and the most meaningful learnings too. And you do that through conversation with these people and just getting to know them and asking them the right questions. And how do you get to know them better? And how do you get to ask them the right questions? By being familiar with more things. What is the most effective and timeless way of doing that? Well, I think you can anticipate the answer to that, which is by reading and writing. Reading inherently is perspective taking. It's going into another viewpoint and thinking from that angle for however many pages that book lasts. And you're able to translate that into relationships with other people. And it is with other people that anything gets done, because nothing has ever occurred as a lone wolf. It is always a result of a team or a supporting cast of some sort, even if tiny. With that in mind, keep in mind that literacy is a superpower. And to that end, if you want to keep abreast on how I am feeding, how I'm watering my superpower every day, trying to get more super at that power, check out my Instagram, because I post there every day on what I'm reading, my highlights and stickies, and I go through my books on the podcast really in a random order. And what I'm reading is pretty much always going to be, is necessarily always going to be different than the podcast coming out at approximately the same time, because obviously if I haven't finished the book yet, I'm not recording it. So you're not going to get the same messages at the same time as my podcast. So there is some variety there. Check that out if you want to stay abreast on that. Get your daily dose of knowledge. Something to think about for the day, some food for thought, maybe something to incorporate into what you're doing or conversations with others. And you know what? I'm learning a lot of vocabulary too. There are a lot of words out there that I don't know. So if you like learning your vocab, I also post on there. I highlight in the book the word that I don't know, and I put the definition there. I write it out so I can remember it better. And if you're into that, it's available. Farewell.